This episode is not about Zero. This episode is about Kanna, the bind, and the bind resist. Summary of this video: these two skills, their bind resist is 60 seconds. Bind resist starts to count after bind ends. Bind timer starts to count after bind hits. Now let's do some experiment on the first statement. I'm going to bind him with this skill and wait until the bind ends. I'm not going to look at the timer, I'm going to look at this sign instead to see when the bind ends. Once the bind ends, I immediately do another bind. If you open up the old chat, it will tell you how many seconds more until you can do the next bind. Now let's try Ada Nova. After bind ends, I immediately do another bind. From the old chart, as you can see, this time is 88 seconds. And here's the comparison. This shows that Kanna bind's resist is 60 seconds, whereas the other bind is 90 seconds. Next statement. Bind resist starts to count after bind ends. First, I'm going to bind. And while bind is still in effect, I'm going to do another bind. You can see from the chart the message doesn't show up. After bind ends, I'm going to do the third bind. Now the message shows up. This proves that bind resist starts to count after bind ends. The last statement, bind timer starts to count after bind hits. Now I'm going to do a Kanna Bigfoot bind because this bind has animation before the bind hits. I press my skill at 15. Now I'm not going to look at the time, I'm going to look at this sign instead to see when the bind ends. The bind ends at 56. If you do the math, it shows that the bind timer starts to count at 11 seconds. This shows that bind timer starts to count after the bind hits. But please don't forget your bind duration can be increased depending on the damage you dealt. In conclusion, after the bind hits, for Kanna small bind, the next available bind is after 70 seconds. For the Bigfoot bind, it's after 75 seconds. For the other bind, it's after 100 seconds. One last thing you have to know is that Mercedes Union will reduce the cooldown of your 4th Joe skill bind. So if you are using cooldown to estimate your next available bind, remember to take that into consideration.